I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the program, I'd like to remind you that you can support my work on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. $10 and above supporters get a producer's credit shout out at the end of each and every edition of this show. And also, I'm going to be releasing the latest edition of the Parallax vlog for $5 tier and above supporters tonight, and tomorrow. So you do get some goodies if you support Parallax Views on Patreon. And of course, there's the $1 tier. Even a dollar helps. So again, patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that out of the way, boy, do I have an interesting show for you today, dear listener. We're going to be hearing about the CDC's war on opioids from a man with 28 years of experience as a CDC epidemic control specialist, Dr. Charles LeBaron, who is the author of a book that I consider very important, very thoughtful, that recently came out, entitled Greed to Do Good, The Untold Story of CDC's Disastrous War on Opioids, a CDC physician's personal account. I think the title says it all. This is going to be a provocative and, I hope, fascinating conversation for you, the listener, to hear. So with that being said, let's get right to it with Dr. Charles LeBaron. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very, very excited to be speaking with. I find his recent book, Greed to Do Good, The Untold Story of CDC's Disastrous War on Opioids, to be a very interesting and important read. Charles LeBaron, MD, welcome to the show. And I should mention, you're a former Center for Disease Control epidemiologist, which makes this book all the more interesting. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
So let's begin with your personal story, because I think personal testimony is very impactful. Not only did you work at the CDC as an epidemiologist and you've been a physician, but you've also had personal experience with dealing with pain. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how it informed this book.
Well, it's certainly said in medical school that you learn more from your patients than you do from your books. But what they should have added is you learn more from being a patient than any of either of the two. And in my case, I learned a great deal about opioids quite involuntarily. I got staphylococcal septicemia, which collapsed a bunch of my vertebrae and put me in the ICU, and it was extremely painful. Had meningitis from staph as well. And then in the middle of that, I got disseminated shingles, which is an ulcerative condition of the skin. And that was not quite as painful as advertised from my point of view, because I was in such great pain. Otherwise, it didn't seem like shingles was quite as bad as it was said. But what it did do, having all these ulcerations all over me, has made me very hard to get comfortable in any fashion with my collapsed vertebrae. So it was an enlightening experience, to say the least. It lasted about a couple weeks in the hospital, and then about 6 months at home on intravenous antibiotics. That showed me more about opioids than I had ever learned in school or when I prescribed them to other people.
So you can sort of come at this from the perspective of a CDC epidemiologist, although I don't, to be clear, I don't think you dealt with the opioid side of things when you were with the CDC. You've also been a physician and, as you said, a patient who dealt with severe pain. What was the turning point where you felt compelled to speak out and write this book?
Well, the turning point was when it was so hard to get pain relief. There's nothing like pain to educate you about what pain is like. From a standpoint of physician, you're always meeting people who are in pain. You develop a certain amount of, I wouldn't say callousness, but you have to have a certain amount of detachment in the face of that. When you're having the pain yourself, it's very difficult to have that equivalent amount of detachment. And what I experienced during my prolonged adventures in pain was that 30 seconds of really excruciating pain will convince you that there are very few things more important in life than being in that level of pain. And for me, the only thing that would relieve it was opioids. There are other medications that can help relieve pain, and they have fewer adverse effects. But most of them have, in a sense, ceilings on what they can provide in terms of pain. And only opioids in the current pharmacology that's available to physicians are those which can actually mitigate pain down to the point where you're not screaming all the time. And what I discovered is that in response to the opioid epidemic, a great deal of restrictions have been placed on legitimate opioids on the premise that they're starter drugs for people who would otherwise go on to addiction. And those restrictions were marvelously unpleasant for me because I'd be in really excruciating pain and the pharmacy would say, no, we can't have somebody pick up the meds. You have to come down yourself. Well, I'm flat on my back in bed and screaming. And they say, no, the rules are the rules and so forth. So encountering an enormous number of restrictions on opioids when you're in really critical pain was basically the educating event that propelled me into looking a little bit more deeply into the opioid situation.
Now, I wanted you to be able to talk about your time at the CDC. As I said, I don't think you were dealing specifically with the opioid epidemic. You were dealing with issues related to vaccination and preventable diseases. But how did being involved with the CDC as an epidemiologist help you in writing this book and providing insights that others may not have had?
Well, it requires a little bit of background about the opioid epidemic, and in a sense, as you're saying, JG, how would I, a guy who basically worked on eliminating measles and trying to eradicate polio and so forth, somehow ended up thinking a great deal about opioids. And to drop back for 1 second on the opioid epidemic, in a sense, it was a self-inflicted epidemic during the late 1990s and early 2000s. It was basically open season on prescribing opioids on the premise that nobody should be in pain at all. Now, of course, none of us want anyone to be in pain, but pain is like sorrow. There are aspects to life that are a little bit painful. And however, there became this notion of zero tolerance for pain. And of course, the companies that made opioids were very happy to promote that and encourage it.
The Sackler family in Purdue, right? Yeah.
Well, they're the most famous, but if they were an isolated instance, it would be wonderful, but they weren't an isolated instance. There was this notion that anyone who's in pain should get opioids. And that became almost an ideology, which was very, very profitable for a whole bunch of companies, to the point where if you compared, say, Europe for operations that people got, for the same operation, 5% of Europeans got an opioid and 80% of Americans got an opioid, suggested that there was a different standard of care. I don't think the Europeans are that tougher than we are. They may be a little tougher, but I'm not sure they're that much tougher. And in certain studies, people who reported no pain whatsoever after operations were still getting opioids, just sort of almost as if it were a vitamin O. So we basically allowed a self-inflicted addiction to develop. It became normalized to have opioids, and as a result, a whole bunch of people became functionally addicted to opioids, and with that, more and more people overdosed. Needless to say, the more opioids are a dangerous medication, and a lot of people died. And CDC, which is supposed to handle epidemics, people began concluding we had an opioid epidemic. And CDC decided to jump in because we do epidemics at CDC. And this is coming around to your question, how did I get involved? Well, that's what I did. I was an epidemic control person. And epidemic control, you basically go after the pathogen. You say, okay, what's the harmful external event that's happening here and how we bring it under control? The difficulty with what happened in CDC is the folks, or my colleagues, who had done a very good job basically limiting pathogens access to human beings, applied the same, in a sense, mindset to opioids. Opioids became treated as if they were pathogens and said, we're going to crack down on them. And in a sense, that's all I did for my 28 years at CDC, crack down on pathogens. So I was very, very familiar with the psychology of how you crack down on pathogens, how you vaccinate people, how you develop immunity, and so forth. The difficulty is when you crack down on opioids, no one ever needed a little bit of smallpox or a little bit of measles to get along. And no one found that, polio was absolutely essential for their well-being. The difficulty is opioids fall into a whole different category. There are legitimate medications which have serious adverse effects. When CDC jumped in, it was basically regarding the opioids as if they were pathogens. And I was very familiar with that psychology because I had basically gone after pathogens. So when I finally came up for air after all my adventures with collapsed vertebrae and so forth, I said, looking at this looks just like what I used to do when we were trying to eliminate measles, except it's attacking opioids. And it was that, in a sense, inside knowledge of the psychology of an institution that allowed me to kind of say, I kind of know what's going on here. It's misapplication of a very good spirit in regard to pathogens into an entirely different zone, and then it malfunctions completely.
Can you break down where that psychology of treating opioids as pathogens falls short, or where it can create problems?
Well, the problem is, like me, when you have collapsed vertebrae, I needed some opioids to survive. And there are legitimate purposes for which opioids are needed.
Can I interrupt you just one moment?
Please do.
I
Yeah.
just wanted to say, I mean, I'm from Pennsylvania originally. I'm in Florida now,
Okay.
but I was living in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, where we saw the opioid epidemic up close in Pennsylvania. And
Right.
the thing that gets me is it's hard to talk about all of this because on one hand, I have known people that have died because of opioid addiction. I've also
Right.
known people, though, that now can't get access to the opioid treatments they need to live. And I think most people don't know how to deal with that and talk about it because I don't want to offend anyone, but there are people that need these treatments.
Absolutely. The interesting thing is we're in a paradoxical double whammy. We have the people who need it can't get it. The people who really should be helped to get off it have free access. And where this came about is that we created, in a sense, a legal epidemic of opioids, courtesy of the Sacklers and Malin Rhodes and a whole bunch of other companies. And then suddenly we made the country go cold turkey on the legal stuff. Well, take a guess what happened. There are a bunch of entrepreneurs in Mexico who said, I think we can, occupy some of that market. And we'll get some ingredients from China, put them together. We'll get some really potent cocktails, and we'll import them into the United States. As a result, instead of having, which was in the early 2000s, access, if you're an addict or in pain, to FDA scrutinized safe medications, suddenly the people either in pain or addiction, really the only access they could get was to illegal stuff, which became very, very prevalent. And as a result, overdoses right after the CDC implemented its draconian restrictions exploded. And it was a paradoxical thing because here it was, in a sense, with good intentions, CDC decided that they were going to stop the opioid epidemic by restricting access to legal stuff. The result is everybody went to the illegal stuff, and the very thing that they were trying to prevent, which was overdoses, quadrupled. That's not good in public health when you make things 4 times worse.
So you mentioned with regards to the psychology of, okay, so we're going to go after the pathogen. In this case, the opioid is the pathogen. Is it fair to
Right.
say that there's something that almost feels like it's pseudo-scientific to say, oh, well, we're going to treat this just as a pathogen? Do you think there was a big mistake made by the CDC in doing that?
Well, I am applying Freudian tactics to my old institution, which I am very, very loyal. And I'm like a army guy who comes out of a war or battle saying that was really mishandled and we have to improve the army to make it better. I believe very much in CDC and what it does. And it's under attack now, and I'm a great defender of it. However, it makes mistakes. And the mistake was one of attitude in many ways. And the people who are in charge had very distinguished careers in either eradicating or limiting pathogens. And what happens in the army, as I understand, but certainly in public health, you're always fighting the last battle. If you won the last battle, you say, well, I'm just going to apply the tactics to the next battle. And so the mentality, it's no dishonor faced with a difficult situation to use what tactics have been successful in a different environment and apply them. There's no dishonor in that. Where the dishonor comes is when things get worse and worse and worse, and you just keep doing the same thing, and which is what happened. CDC basically went on for 6, 7 years with this exploding overdoses and didn't budge because it had this sense that you have to be tenacious about your tactics and sooner or later things will get better. Well, they didn't get better.
I
And
think
that
that's a
was,
better way to put it. It's not even an issue of like us taking a pseudoscientific approach. It's that, you're fighting one battle the way you fought the previous battle, and in this case, the tactics used in the previous battle don't work in the current one.
right, exactly right. And as I understand, this is studied all the time at West Point and Annapolis and so forth. It should be studied, and that was what I had in mind when I wrote the book. It should be studied in public health because, for instance, the CDC director, who was basically the motivating person on this, had a really distinguished career in India, probably saved hundreds of thousands of lives in India through a tactic called directly observed therapy. The problem in TB is that people don't take their meds, and then you get resistant TB and it spreads. So he insisted anybody who had TB had to be observe taking their meds and the right meds. So it was a coercive approach. And it worked well. They saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Comes to the US, they think, well, that worked. I think I'll apply this to opioids. And no, didn't work. Had the opposite effect.
So you're arguing that the CDC's opioid guidelines, which were intended to save lives, and I think that was really the intent, have in some ways worsened the crisis. It's a very tragic paradox. Walk us through how that happened. What specifically about the CDC's opioid guidelines led to problems?
Well, they took a look at the situation, which was quite correct. Their examination of the situation is correct. The US was consuming 80% of the opioids in the United States with 5% of the population. And they said a lot of people who were addicted reported that they'd started out basically getting opioids for a sprained ankle or something, and then couldn't get off the stuff. So they said, the way to do this is just to restrict initial access to it. And there are only really three ways that you can do it. One is try and have as few people as possible get opioids, have them get as low a dose as possible, and have them get it on the opioids for as short a time as possible. Now, there's nothing wrong with taking a dangerous drug, and opioids are dangerous drugs, and being prudent about them. Where it becomes a problem is where you become draconian, puritanical about the situation. And then what happens is two things are very powerful in life. One is pain, and the other is addiction. People who are faced with those two things, if they're restricted from safe medications, take a guess, the guy on the corner who has a nice muscle car and everything is very happy to provide you with everything you need. And then you take this stuff and overdose. And that is not, again, that's an unexpected. They didn't expect that, and they didn't anticipate it. And there's no dishonor in not being totally, clear-sighted on everything that's going to happen. Where the problem is if things get worse in a battle, in a war, or something, you're supposed to scratch your head. You say, maybe we should kind of check out what we're doing and if there's an alternative or something. That wasn't done. And it's a curiosity, and I report that I'm part of it in infectious disease. You have to be very tenacious in getting rid of infectious diseases. They're tough things to get rid of. They're wily pathogens, and they want to stick around. And we're their food. Viruses love to eat us, and they don't want to be driven away. So you have to be tenacious. The problem is you have to also be empirical. Is it working or isn't? And for reasons which aren't clear to me, people became robotic about these restrictions. I will give you a hypothesis. There's a certain amount of puritanism in America around opioids. They don't regard them as medications with uses and misuses and adverse effects. They're regarded as sort of as a scandalous kind of situation. So love-hate relationship. And preceding this had been another version of the same thing, except it was called the war on drugs, where we started incarcerating everybody. And in a sense, they're both the same thing. They're supply side oriented. They're saying, okay, can we lock up the people who are giving the illegal stuff? And that's a supply side. And in this case, it was, can we prevent people from prescribing it? And a supply side. Well, there's merit to supply side. However, if you don't deal with the demand side, you basically inevitably have a worsening situation which is exactly what you pointed out, JG. You have this paradoxical thing where the people who need it can't get the stuff, and the people who probably shouldn't have it are ODing on the illegal stuff, and that's where we stand right now.
Do you think there was an issue where um, I want to be careful how I say this because I'm not trying to attack the CDC. Like you, I think the CDC has some great uses and they're already under attack by forces that I don't agree with. But was there an issue with did we as a society respond to the opioid crisis with panic in a way that sort of cloud our vision with how to deal with the issue? I feel like in a way we panicked rather than looking at the science and calmly figuring out, well, how do we deal with this crisis? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Panic often, yeah, you see in these really awful, music venue things where, a fire breaks out. Like two people get killed from the fire, and 80 people get killed in a stampede. And in a sense, the same sort of goes on in this situation with opioids, that they're regarded in an alarmist fashion or in a denialist fashion. And that we had the denialist fashion with in the early 2000s with prescriptions, and then we converted immediately. And this is we Americans have a tendency to do this. We go from one extreme to the next. And from going from denial, where we said, oh, there's no trouble with opioids and everybody should get them if they have a hangnail, suddenly into nobody should get them. And we just do a complete whiplash on the situation. And that's what happened, at least in my opinion. And it was, in each case, was the fascinating thing. You could describe the intentions as good. Initially, nobody should be in pain, right? That's good intention, right? Then secondarily, we have to eliminate these, ridiculously high rates of prescription stuff. And we go from one extreme to the next. And we
It's
can't,
almost like there was an overcorrection.
you got it exactly right, where, slippery roadway and you start sliding one way and then you crank your wheels the other way, you end up upside down, and to a great extent, that's what's happened. Now, having trashed my um, former employer of more than a quarter century, I do want to say that it's under heavy attack now, but for all the wrong reasons. And I think that the key thing that CDC can do, which it has been doing recently, is very carefully monitoring the situation and finding out what is happening with overdoses, what seems to be working, what doesn't seem to be working. And that function absolutely has to be maintained, but it's in great danger now because things are being cut right, left, and center at CDC. So it may sound paradoxical, but the Division of Overdose Prevention, which the subject of the book is how things went wrong, very much needs to be protected because they are righting the ship now, slowly and a little bit late. But if we don't have that, we're unilaterally disarming in the face of an epidemic, and we can't have that.
Yeah, and I think that's very important to note because I think people have to differentiate between criticizing an institution for its mistakes because you want it to be reformed and to actually be more efficient and better, and just sort of attacking an institution and then having no plans for, well, how do we make it better? Oh, let's just take a wrecking ball to it. That does not work. That's very bad.
Exactly right, JJ. You're putting your finger on it. The irony of the thing is that I published this book, which is very, very critical of what CDC did, and then the CDC came under attack, and I basically led the demonstration to try and protect the Division of Overdose Prevention from being eliminated. I don't know if we succeeded, but it seems to have survived the most recent cuts. and work with people in SIA. How can we defend you? And it's the same as I would say, just coming back to the military analogy, you can disagree very much with how a battle is fought, but you don't think that basically we should unilaterally disarm in the face of a very serious situation. Just to put it in context, um, basically at the current rate, which is somewhat mitigated right now, in about 10 or 11 years, we will have overdosed to death 1 million people. When you kill off 1 million people every decade from overdosing, you can regard that as a serious public health problem. That's the number one killer, number one killer of people between the age of 50 and 45. That's, most people, I'm a little older than that, so I hesitate to say it's the prime of life, but I think of myself as still being in the prime, but most people regard those are the folks that we hate to lose. We hate to lose anybody, but those are the folks. And there are more deaths from that than are firearms and automobiles combined. So this is a serious problem for which we need people somewhere at the helm at CDC. Even if they've institutionally made some mistakes in the past, let's make sure they understood those mistakes and then correct them.
Can we talk about where the mistakes came from? I mean, when it came to the push to limit opioid doses, what was the evidence this was based on? Was it weak evidence? And were there a lot of false presumptions made about patients and how they would become addicted?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the to their credit, the scientists who put it together are required, which is good, to indicate the level of certainty with which their evidence suggests an intervention will work. And they correctly, in the recommendations that they made, which I think were misguided, they indicated very clearly that the level of evidence was weak. Now, basically, there are only three levels of evidence. Weak, it's sort of Goldilocks. Weak, strong, or in between. And weak is the lowest category that you can have. Usually, what you do in public health is you sometimes have to navigate in the dark. You have to navigate with weak evidence. You have an unknown pathogen that arrives. You haven't seen it before. You have to do the best you can. This was a little different situation because if you regard opioids as pathogen, they weren't exactly unknown. They've been around since zero AD. But where you are required, if you're flying semi-blind, is to be very careful and judicious about your intervention. In this case, it was the reverse. You had weak evidence and extraordinarily strong recommendations. And that combination of having a weakness on the science and very, very dramatic, draconian recommendations is a gap they shouldn't have in public health. And in terms of the specifics, yes, there's evidence that people who got, I think there's ample evidence, who had oxycodone for a sprained ankle went on to become addicted. So there's not an absence of evidence for basically prescribed opioids being a starter medication. But is there intervention evidence that if you suddenly prevent people who legitimately need the opioids, it'll stop the overdoses? And the first thing you would look at in public health, which I've done, is you basically look at the target population. The average person, the most representative person who gets opioids, prescribed opioids. Is a 60-year-old woman who has rheumatoid arthritis. The most representative person, and this is back when they made the recommendation, they've changed somewhat now, who overdosed was a 30-year-old guy who shot up. So you immediately had to ask the question, if we're going to prevent the 60-year-old lady from getting her rheumatic pain meds, how is that exactly going to prevent the 30-year-old guy from shooting up? And it really requires a lot of leaps of faith to get from one thing to the next. And that kind of targeting analysis really wasn't done. And I think they'd all admit it now, who the folks who came up with it.
One of the things that's most interesting, these guidelines come out in 2016, and they're pretty much adopted very quickly throughout the entire healthcare system. And,
You got it.
that's very interesting because, most of the recommendations that physicians and the CDC come out with are, oh, people should eat right, exercise, whatever. And those don't even get, it's difficult to get people to do those things. And yet these recommendations, which, like you said, were very draconian, just were like really quickly implemented.
Oh,
Can you speak to that?
if it had been something that I worked on, that would have been a dream come true. Everybody just rushes to adopt everything that, I've written recommendations, and they, you're lucky if anyone reads them. It's virtue, as you're saying. Everybody should, have their ideal body weight. They should, watch what they eat. All those things. People just sort of start snoring when they hear that there's something going on. And what you're correctly saying and pointing out, JG, is that the psychology of draconian supply restriction is not something that CDC alone had as a failing. It was endorsed by everybody because, just like the war on drugs, there was this, in a sense, anger at the people who are getting these things. If we can be mean to them, maybe they'll get their act together. And in the case of pain and in the case of addiction, being mean to people doesn't seem to work very well. But that enthusiasm to be angry in the face of a frustrating situation is a real danger. And we in public health are not immune to the idea of being frustrated and then starting to have our sort of anger gene come out of hiding and start pounding the table and saying it's going to happen. But it turned out that we set a forest fire going. If we were a little angry, by the time we put out the Rex, the whole country was enthusiastically angry.
So the title of your book, Greed to Do Good, I want to clarify this because the greed that you're talking about is not, financial motivation type greed. I think you're talking about a certain sense of pride, maybe even this may be a little bit more critical, but like hubris that, can sometimes occur in an agency or an institution. So I think that the CDC was very caught up in its reputation as, we're the world's premier public health agency. And maybe that led to an issue where, hey, we have this belief that we can't do wrong. We're going to take it all on. And I do think Obama's CDC director, Tom Frieden, was very ambitious in his campaigns to go after tuberculosis, to deal with the issue of smoking in public places, etc. But maybe that sort of ambition led to issues when it came to dealing with the opioid crisis. Can you speak to that?
No, you're putting your finger on it. Everybody who goes into public health should be ambitious. They should want to get something done. They should be able to, have something to their credit. And all of us want to have something to our credit, that we did something, a bad actor got shown the exit door, from the United States. We don't have to worry about malaria. We don't have to worry about measles. We don't have to worry about things. And that's because I helped do it. So everybody should feel that way. And it's good. Where the problem comes is it becomes sort of a Macbethian situation where you just sort of go overboard and don't recognize that you may be doing more harm than good. So the greed to do good, in a sense, rather than having the wish to do good, it becomes an overweening ambition. I think I don't even know what overweening is exactly. It's some literary term, but it falls into this category of you become overly ambitious to do something, and you end up hurting harming the very situation, the people that you were trying to save, because of that ambitiousness, that greed that you have got out of hand. And I think I mean, if you want a more humorous situation, Tom Frieden, who has again saved hundreds of thousands of lives. So I want to put this in a context, and has done an enormous amount of good work. When he was New York City health commissioner, he decided obesity was no good. So he came up with all these rules on how large the soft drink bottles you could have. You couldn't have more than a liter. So, well, needless to say, there's a terrible backlash on that. He wasn't able to restrict the size of soft drink bottles, and he had to retreat very quickly. Unfortunately, with opioids, when he basically did the same thing, instead of he was basically doing the soft drink restriction on opioids. We didn't back off that fast. And a lot of people drink soft drinks. And so there was a large population or fewer people who need opioids, in particular people who are really in really terrible pain or don't run out and contribute to, they're lying in their bed, so they can't contribute to campaigns, political campaigns very easily, so they can't get back at you. And the result of that, in a sense, greed to do good, which is, I think, prevalent in the both the initiation of the opioid epidemic with this desire to eliminate any vestige of pain anywhere in anybody, and then the greed to do good on we're going to stop all prescribing that shouldn't be prescribed. Both of those backfired very, very badly. And we've whiplashed back and forth. And that was the notion of the title of the book, taking a little bit of what was the Wall Street with Michael Douglas and greed is good. In this case, it was greed to do good, not financial. Well, of course, the Sacklers had a lot of financial stuff, but the initial, let's not have anybody in pain, and then let's not have anybody prescribed opioids, were a whiplash, greed to do good, and it has backfired terribly.
You mentioned something really interesting that, the typical person who's having an overdose, 30-year-old male taking illicit medication. The most typical person who's getting chronic opioids for pain would be a 60-year-old woman with a variety of rheumatological conditions. Now, that's really interesting that you brought that up because a lot of people will say to me, what does it matter? Opioids have done so much harm. Maybe we should have this draconian crackdown on opioids. And I'll say, well, what you're doing is you're actually normalizing illegal acquisition of
Yeah, right.
opioids. Ultimately, pain is a big motivator. And, once you make these things impossible to get for people that really need them, they're going to find ways to get them. They'll say, I know a guy. And I have to tell you a story real quick, and then I'll let you go
Right.
on. But, I had a friend who needed opioid medications, and they were worried about being taken off of them, just cold turkey. And they said, if I have to find some guy, I'll find some guy. And,
Right.
people don't look at it that way. They don't realize that, it can lead to people going after opioids in an illegal way or getting these medications in a legal way.
Yeah, and the danger is you're pointing out, in contrast to prohibition, nobody ever died of their first shot of speakeasy gin, right? But a whole bunch of people have died of their first pill from the one of the cartels, uh, fentanyl. So that you have to be very careful with these things that you don't propel people into the illegal market where all the overdoses, very few overdoses now occur from legal prescribed opioids. It's very tiny percent. Almost all of them are from the illegal market that in a sense we've propelled people into by making people who have legitimate needs for opioids almost impossible to get them.
Can you also speak to the differences between addiction versus dependence versus pain relief and just the issue of how exaggerating the risk of addiction can also become its own problem?
Well, addiction is a legitimate problem. The
Yeah,
difficulty
I'm
with,
not trying to underplay that. I hope it didn't
no, I
sound
know
that
you're
way.
not. I know you're not. Is a legitimate issue, but the thing that is curious about it is dependence is a physiologic phenomenon where your body basically becomes dependent upon this exogenous opioid coming in from the outside, and that has physiologic consequences. And particularly if you're taken off the meds, you go into withdrawal and so forth. That's a medical and physiologic. Addiction has much more sociologic overtones, where the implication is that you're doing harm to yourself in some fashion or another. And the usual harms that are mentioned are, loss of employment, not doing well with your kids, a whole your life sort of going south. The difficulty with that is that a lot of those consequences arise from the illegality of the opioids that you're getting, and the fact that you can't get them otherwise, so that you end up in a criminal environment and so forth. To some extent, that's a circular reasoning on the situation because you have a problem because you have a problem. And we're going to stop the problem by making you unable to get the opioids, in which case you resort to less than satisfactory means. The difficulty with all that is that how you get out of that tangle. And the first thing you have to do on any of these situations is say, what does work? And I'm going to be very emergency room type guy on this thing, which is a different issue. We have a mass poisoning. We have 100,000 people dying a year of a poison, most of which is brought in from imported poison, as a matter of fact. If you have a mass poisoning, you need a mass availability of antidotes. There's an antidote. It's cheap. It's easy to get. It doesn't cost much. We should have a mass availability of the antidote at a level of the mass poisoning that we're undergoing. So that's just pure mitigation situation. Doesn't deal with the underlying problem. But it's certainly nice when a college freshman doesn't die because he took a pill that somebody handed him. You don't want people dying 100,000 things. So the first thing you got to do is try and reduce the level of mortality, the death rate. The second thing is that if there are people, and there are about 17 million of them, who are in pain, one reason or another, to the point where their functioning is impaired, that they either can't work or do things.
Right. We're
Those,
talking here about chronic pain. Yeah.
right, exactly right. Not somebody who just came out of having an appendectomy. They're going to get some opioids. It usually isn't too much of a problem getting a one-day supply or something of opioids. But people who've gone through terrible accidents, come out of a war or whatever, and have really terrible pain. They should have access to it, and it shouldn't be. We shouldn't apply the standards that CDC, for instance, came up with. You have to get. Matter of fact, at one point they were trying to get everybody off opioids. Everybody, zero. Well, it's just not a useful goal because you're just inflicting misery on the thing. So those folks, and they're about 17 million estimate. It could be more, it could be less. They should have access to prescribed medications under a well-monitored medical situation. So that's number two. Number three, if you're going to come up with recommendations on the use of opioids, it shouldn't come from law enforcement agencies. It shouldn't come from bureaucrats at CDC or elsewhere. It should come from the organizations that have expertise in dealing with pain and with addiction. And there are societies, and they come up with recommendations or variants with CDC, but they're much more reasonable because they know exactly how to deal with these issues. The final element is that you have basically a population of folks who are addicted, and that is estimated in the 2 or 3 million things. If you really wanted to do something about the cartel profits, if that's important, we remember we're always talking about the demonic cartel, and they are pretty demonic. The best way to cut off their profits is put people who are addicted into treatment. Spend the money on treatment instead of National Guard marching up and down borders and so forth. Put it into treatment, and you cut off the demand for the illegal thing. So that's number three. Number four, I'm giving you my little prescriptions for America type thing, but it's nothing revolutionary about it. Number four, monitor the situation and see if you're doing any good. And don't eliminate CDC's overdose prevention and make us blind and deaf, dumb, and blind about what's going on. Know what's going on. If things are getting worse, then you say how we adapt our tactics. If things are getting better, what worked and how we expand on them. And those elements, the having an antidote, having the people who need it be able to get it, having the recommendations sensible by experts, and having basically treatment for addicts and monitor the situation. This didn't require astrophysics to come up with those things. And ultimately, if you're faced with 1 million deaths every decade, you should be serious about it.
When it comes to those 2016 guidelines, was there any experts that weren't really consulted on it, like maybe like pain specialists, or was there any specific problems with those guidelines? Were there elements that were, or voices that could have been included that weren't, or?
Oh, there was a fuss and a half. They just, when they came out, there was an enormous amount of objections from the folks who dealt most with those things, so we were never consulted. One group said they couldn't figure out whether it was a comedy of errors or what it was. And part of the reason was that if you've won a bunch of battles, I know how to fix things, and you become very, very convinced of your infallibility in the thing, and that others are in the way, and we're going to not be obstructed by them. So the notion that you have to consult the experts in this case was completely ignored. And not only was it was interesting because they admitted I'm proud of them when they put out the recs, the poor little people who are writing the things, the lying iron pill. They said there's weak evidence. Well, there's a way to get stronger evidence. And that's consult with the experts and try and work with them and figure it out. But I will say one thing, that the attraction that you were going back, JG, to the question you had, how did this get adopted by everybody on Earth? The 30 seconds later, and it never happens. Have one great sales pitch. It's free. Free. You come out with a recommendation that requires not a cent of extra appropriation for anybody. You just said, nobody should get more than 30 milligram morphine equivalents on that. You just say it. You don't have to spend a cent on that. So it had the attraction of being virtuous and absolutely cost-free. And believe me, in government, cost-free puts you on a Bo Derek 10 of what you should of attractiveness to policymakers.
I just had a few more questions. I wanted to ask, and I hope this isn't too controversial of a question, but was there a way in which political and media narratives, or even political and media sort of pressures, contributed to a climate of fear that may have not been as useful to bettering the situation when it came to the opioid crisis?
Well, the one thing I can say is that, and this is true, um, I won't use the words I prefer to use, but I'll use other words. This was a bipartisan mess up. You'll take my words with them. And the reason is this started during our Obama administration, right? 2016, it was in there. Then it continued in the Trump administration. Then it continued in the Biden administration. And to some extent, it's now created in Trump too. So if you go looking for ways to politicize this, you're going to have to figure out something other than the traditional political parties to do it. And it's I wish there were a third party which said, we're the sensible approach to opioid party. Now that hasn't come up yet. I haven't, but it would be very nice to have that party on the ballot. But I think there are other issues that people are interested in. However, if you're looking for pure politics, it's a complicated situation.
How has all of this affected the trust between patients in pain, their doctors, and public health institutions? Has it hurt the trust between those three different actors? And how can we rebuild that trust?
Well, that's a tough one. When I was in really terrible pain, I was coming out of the hospital. And as far as I'm concerned, I had two things that are absolutely essential. One was to get my antibiotics so I could clear the thing. The other was to get my oxycodone so I could. One was going to help my body survive. The other was going to help my mind survive. And both were equally important to me. And you live in your mind even more than your body in some ways. And so when I was going to be discharged, I spoke to my primary care doc. I said, well, of course, I'm, going to need both of those. He said, well, no, there's no trouble getting, the antibiotic. And I said, but there's something else, Well, we can talk about that. And I won't reproduce some of the internal words that I was using when I was thinking about that. But basically, I went doctor shopping until I found somebody who would prescribe the meds that I needed on the thing. So the effect of these rules have been very actually tough on docs as well. I'm a doc, remember, I prescribed opioids, so I know it from the other side.
I wanted to ask you about that because I feel like doctors have actually been negatively impacted by this too, in ways that we overlook. I mean, I think about the patients in pain first, but even the doctors have been impacted.
Well, no, in a very negative sense. And it's created a culture of fear because what happens, because these got widely adopted, the DEA and others, and I think you can't fault them quite as much as you can CDC. So, well, look, we'll just regard these guidelines as what the norm should be. And if you're prescribing more, then you're a problem. And if you're prescribing a lot more, then we need to arrest you and take your license away. And you're basically a connection. You're not a doc. And of course, there are docs who do that. So it isn't like that's a non-existent problem. But when you have such draconian rules, and you see other doctors being arrested for exceeding the guidelines, you say, look, I got some mouths to feed and a kid to go to college and all this thing. Yeah, this guy's in pain, but he can handle it. He's just getting the max that the guidelines say. And that undermines the entire trust between doctor and patient, because the doctor is supposed to represent not themselves, they're supposed to represent the patient. And what I will say is that the interesting thing about this is that looking into the data, in the early 2000s, there was the opposite effect, though not legal. That was the point at which they entered in the large healthcare institution, started rating doctors on their satisfaction scores. And it turned out that satisfaction scores were heavily influenced just by what the patient thought about the doctor, not how well the doctor is performing, because most of us wouldn't know exactly how to do a lung transplant, and so that you sort of have to delegate some of that. But there's good evidence that patient satisfaction scores, as they were implemented, this back in the 2000s, actually had a significantly strong influence on basically pushing more and more opioids into people who didn't need them. Then, so that was the 2000s. Then the backlash phenomenon after CDC, docs were scared to give people who didn't need them the meds, and that created a real culture of fear, to the point where most primary care docs did not want to treat anybody with pain, chronic pain, because it put them in the danger. You could give diuretics, you give antibiotics. No one's going to come knocking at your door at 3 o'clock in the morning and take you away in handcuffs. But exceeding the CDC guidelines for docs was very, very serious.
One or two more questions. The first is a big one that I should have covered earlier, but we'll cover it now, and that's it's a very difficult topic. But how has cutting people off from opioid medications when they actually need it? They have chronic pain. There's no question this is a treatment for them. When you cut people off from that, has this led to, I guess you would call it knock-on effects? I guess what I'm referring to is people taking their own lives or being driven to deaths of despair. Is there a connection?
Yes, and actually it was studied before the CDC came up with this rec, so they knew about the studies, so it wasn't that they didn't know about the studies. It's particularly well studied in the Veterans Administration because you have a contained population. It isn't a population that goes shopping around to different docs. You can kind of observe the thing. And what was observed in a number of VA studies was people who were cut off from opioids, who needed them for some legitimate reason at some point, but it was decided that they had to be weaned down involuntarily to meet the CDC guidelines ultimately, but before that, just to be weaned down or weaned off, had a much higher rate of suicide. than those who didn't have to undergo that kind of thing. It's called involuntary reduction. And I wouldn't say that's the major contributor to suicide in the United States, but it's a major contributor to an adverse effect of involuntary reductions. And it's a legitimate concern because in my book, I described that the mere thought of being cut off from my opioids when I was on them made me immediately start thinking, what's the easiest way I can do away with myself? How can I do that? And doing away with myself isn't something that I came into this with all sorts of thoughts about. But sure, this isn't tolerable as an existence that I thought about. So not only are those studies scientifically well grounded, but for me, they're very, very well grounded emotionally. What would have happened to me? Now, I don't know if I'd had when you're really sick, it's hard to figure out the means to do away with yourself. I don't have firearms in the house or things, but there are plenty of people who do and take their own lives when they're cut off from a medication that is essential for their continual mental survival.
In closing here, how would you like to see public health policy going forward? Not just when it comes to opioids, but just what could make for a better public health policy? And what would your advice be to the policymakers?
Um, I will quote Winston Churchill of all things. He said, "No matter how beautiful the strategy, it's wise occasionally to consult the results." And there's again in murky situations, and there are many things in public health that are murky. It is absolutely essential to mind the store, see what's going on after you do something. The great danger right now is that CDC, by being under attack, is basically the monitoring situation for a whole bunch of diseases, whether it's sexually transmitted or HIV or opioids or firearms or heart attacks or anything. And that monitoring system is in great danger now, in great danger. So I would say a major lesson, if you had to have one single overriding thing, it goes beyond opioids. It's mind what is going on, respond to it, and then watch what happens from your response. And if we're rendered radarless in any situation, or we refuse to look at the radar, that's our greatest danger.
And in closing, what do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation? And what do you hope they get out of the book, Read to Be Good? What's the one big takeaway you want people to take from all of this?
Good intentions, if pursued greedily, can produce bad effects. And the most important thing is, are you actually interested in the outcome? If you're interested in the outcome, you'll be watching that very carefully. If you're not interested in the outcome, you're going to pursue things into the ground. And that goes for opioids and it goes for almost any health condition. But for opioids, it became very real for me. And that's why I decided, hey, I think I'll publish this thing.
And I want to thank you so much, Charles LeBaron, for coming on Parallax Views. And I want everyone to read this book. I think it's a very important book, especially if you're interested in public health policy. I think it's extremely important. And I just want to say this personally. Like I said, I've known people that have suffered from deaths due to the opioid crisis. I also know people that can't get the treatments they need now, or have had trouble in past years because of this. So I think your book is really important.
Thanks, JJ.
This edition of Parallax Views brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y, Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.